Most people assume that economic systems like capitalism and socialism are black and white. Capitalism is freedom, socialism is failure, or so the story goes. If you grew up hearing that one system always works and the other always fails, you've been told a half-truth. Because the real history of how these systems performed isn't a binary choice between good and bad. It's a complex pattern of successes and failures, surprises and contradictions, and lessons that every citizen should understand. What if I told you that some of the most celebrated socialist policies worked better than many capitalist ones? And some of the most praised capitalist outcomes had disastrous hidden costs? What if the world's economic record didn't fit on a bumper sticker? And what if the biggest mystery of all wasn't which system is best, but why humans repeatedly believe the same economic myths, even when evidence contradicts them? Today on Cash Historian, we're going to answer that mystery and uncover what actually worked and what didn't. To understand capitalism versus socialism, we need to flip the question from slogans to systems. Not ideology, not headlines, but real outcomes. For the next few minutes, we will look through time starting in the 19th century and moving to the present. We'll explore 5 chronological chapters that reveal the real economic effects of these systems. Along the way, we'll uncover 3 massive twists that most people never consider. Twist number 1. Sometimes socialist-style policies outperformed capitalist markets in the short run, but failed over the long run. Twist number 2. Some capitalist economies produced massive wealth, but also catastrophic financial instability. And twist number 3, the outcomes depended less on ideology and more on institutional design, incentives, and social trust. Here on Cash Historian, we dig deeper than anyone else. If you're loving this journey through economic truth, subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. The story begins in the early 1800s when Europe underwent an unprecedented transformation. Steam engines, factories, railroads, and free markets reshaped society. Capitalism, loosely defined as private ownership of production and markets driven by profit and competition, spread swiftly. Manchester became a symbol of industrial capitalism. Workers left farms, flocked to factories, and created enormous increases in productivity. Industrial output soared, wealth expanded. But this era also produced something else that is less often talked about: deep inequality and brutal working conditions. Children worked long hours, safety was optional. Living conditions in industrial cities were often filthy. Capitalism in its early form created wealth and suffering at the same time. That paradox would echo for centuries. In response, philosophical thinkers proposed alternatives, including socialism, which argued that workers should own the means of production. The debates were fierce, but the next century would put both systems to the test. And so we arrive at the next turning point, where experimentation began in earnest. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was the largest socialist experiment in history. The Bolsheviks abolished private ownership of land and industry. They aimed to create an economy where workers collectively owned the output. At first, the results were chaotic. Production collapsed, famine struck. But by mid-20th century, the Soviet Union industrialized rapidly, becoming a world power capable of defeating Nazi Germany. This raises the first critical question. Can an economy without markets and prices allocate resources effectively? The Soviet model showed it could, at least temporarily. Central planning produced massive industrial output in steel, military equipment, and infrastructure. But it struggled with consumer goods, innovation, and efficiency. Meanwhile, in Western Europe after World War II, another model emerged, so-called mixed economies. Capitalism remained dominant, but governments introduced social safety nets, universal health care, and public services. Countries like Sweden and Germany combined market economies with strong social protections. These nations achieved high living standards, low poverty, and stable growth for decades. Not purely capitalist, not purely socialist, but something in between. That balancing act held for decades, raising an essential twist. Real economies aren't pure. They are mixtures of market incentives and social interventions. Which brings us to the next chapter, where the outcomes diverged dramatically. In the 1980s and 1990s, capitalism underwent a reinvention. Thinkers like Milton Friedman and leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher championed deregulation, tax cuts, and globalization. Neoliberal capitalism emphasized free markets, privatization, and reduced government intervention. At the same time, state socialism, especially in the Soviet Union, was facing deep economic strain. By 1991, the Soviet economy collapsed and the USSR disintegrated. Its planned economic system failed to adapt to technological change, consumer preferences, and global integration. Meanwhile, neoliberal capitalism produced incredible innovation, especially in information technology, telecommunications, and finance. But every triumph had a shadow. The deregulation of financial markets in the United States and the United Kingdom helped fuel the 2008 global financial crisis, a collapse triggered by excessive risk-taking in housing, credit derivatives, and shadow banking. This led to the deepest recession since the Great Depression and required massive government intervention to stabilize the system. The paradox was striking. Capitalism rescued itself with socialist-style bailouts. So by the turn of the century, the debate was no longer purely ideology. It was about balance. And this leads to the next chapter, one with profound implications for today's economic landscape. Entering the 2000s, both capitalism and socialism were transformed by globalization, technology, and finance. The 2008 crisis showed the dangers of unregulated capitalism. But the response, central bank bailouts and fiscal stimulus, looked eerily like the old socialist doctrines of state intervention. In Europe, austerity policies and welfare reforms reshaped economies. In the United States, unprecedented quantitative easing expanded central bank balance sheets and altered the relationship between monetary policy and markets. Meanwhile, China offered a unique hybrid, state-led capitalism with tight political control. Export-driven growth lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. But it also created massive debt and state influence over major sectors. By the 2020s, this complex interplay meant that no economy was purely capitalist or purely socialist. Instead, every advanced economy blended markets with state roles in varying degrees. And that brings us to the final chapter, the most relevant for our present moment. Now let's ground theory in reality. As of late 2025, the United States federal government's total national debt has reached approximately $38 trillion, a record high, and far above even the projections just a year earlier. The debt ceiling, a legal limit on how much the government can borrow, now stands near $41.1 trillion after recent increases. This debt exists alongside a broader global debt surge approaching $346 trillion, driven especially by mature economies. On the household side, U.S. consumers carried roughly $18.2 trillion in debt in Q1 2025, with mortgages making up the majority. Despite relatively low unemployment, many families face financial strain, and foreclosure filings have been rising significantly year over year in late 2025. In Canada, household credit market debt surpassed $3 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2024, and mortgages account for the largest share of that burden, contributing to deeply indebted families and a housing market that remains fragile. Canada's household debt relative to GDP hovered near 99.103% in early 2025, among the highest in the world until recent modest declines. Canada's official international reserves also provide context for financial stability, totaling around $128 billion US dollars by late 2025. Meanwhile, central banks around the world, including emerging economies, have been diversifying reserves into gold, with global gold holdings surpassing U.S. Treasuries in central bank portfolios for the first time since the 1990s. What does all of this mean? It means contemporary economic systems continue to blend capitalist markets with social interventions, social welfare programs, debt management strategies, and monetary policies unmatched in history. It means that ideological purity has given way to pragmatic hybrid systems. And it means that history's cycles, periods of boom, debt accumulation, crisis, and reset, continue to repeat. History doesn't say capitalism always wins or socialism always fails. It says that resilience comes from institutions that can adapt, reform, and mitigate crises without undermining public trust. In the end, here are three clear takeaways from this journey through economic systems. First, neither capitalism nor socialism is inherently perfect. Each can produce prosperity or pain depending on how policies are structured and implemented. Second, economic success depends less on ideology and more on institutions. The rule of law, transparency, accountability, and adaptive capacity. Third, debt, if unmanaged, can erode even the strongest economies, whether capitalist, socialist, or hybrid. Now, a chilling warning. History shows that financial stress can erode social trust faster than almost any other factor. If public confidence is lost in markets, governments, or currencies, the consequences can ripple through societies, shaking political stability and economic well-being. So let me ask you this. In a world where economic systems are constantly evolving and hybridizing, which do you believe will be more resilient over the next decade? Markets, social programs, or some entirely new model? Comment your prediction below. And if you found this episode illuminating, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell here on Cash Historian so you never miss a deep dive like this. Thanks for watching. And keep questioning the stories you think you know.